Okay, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Future Ear Radio Podcast. I'm pumped today to be joined by Dr. Frank Wartinger. So, Frank, thanks so much for being on the show. How you doing today?
I'm doing great. I'm happy to be here. Happy to be having this conversation.
Awesome, man. Well, thank you so much for coming on. The last guest I had on was Dr. Mike Santucci, and as doing some of the prep for that episode, I was listening to some other podcasts that he had been on, and I came across yours.
Yep.
Maybe that's a good way to maybe kick things off is share a little bit about your podcast and the motivation for starting that, which I'm sure kind of like leads into your own personal life story. And from there, we can talk about Mike and some of these other influences that you've had throughout your career that I know as well. But let's go back to the start and hear about like your whole immersion into audiology and in the world of hearing health, hearing conservation.
I love it. And your episode with Mike was excellent. I just was listening to that and found it to be you perfectly captured Mike, which is just the best thing. And he's got such an amazing story. I'm gonna pale in comparison, but I'll do my best. You asked me to start about the show. The show's been going for about a year and a half. I started this out of basically I've always had this intense want to share musician stories and help people understand their perspective. I'm a former musician myself, or current musician, former professional engineer myself, and I came to audiology kind of as an outsider's perspective, and found it to be fascinating. But I find that the musician's perspective is just a enigma in the field, and the best way that I wanted to present that was just to let the musician talk, because what I often find is that we, as I'll include you in this, the safety geeks, the health nuts, we tend to kind of thump our textbooks and our hearing bibles and say, this is what you must do to protect your ears. And I always find if I just be quiet for a second, the musician knows what to do, and they'll reflect it back to me in a million better words than I would have ever used. So give them the floor, let them talk. And that was basically the spawn of that. And so it's been going strong, a little slower than we were anticipating, but the production takes a long time, and we try to put some care into it.
That's awesome. And remind the audience, what's the name of your show?
Oh, thank you. It's called Talking Ears. Kind
Talking
of like
Ears.
Talking Heads, but we're very focused on just the ears.
Less David Byrne.
Little less David. Although, David Byrne, hit me up. Come on, Talking Ears.
No, yeah, that would be cool. That would be a hell of a guest. I wonder if he has any sort of tinnitus or hearing conservation related issues, or maybe he's been taking pristine care of his ears.
Neither would surprise me given the genius behind that person.
I know. Okay, so you have this podcast, and it's awesome. Again, I was telling Frank prior to recording that like one of the best parts about this show is it's like you start as like this. You're looking and focused on this one topic, and that leads to a guest, and then that just spawns into all of these different connections and tangents for you to chase down. And so I was able to listen to a few of your episodes, and I found it to be, first off, it's a really interesting format. As a musician, I like that you have like these musical interludes throughout, which are really neat. Very different than my show. It's giving me some food for thought. Maybe I should like bust out my drum kit and start riffing a bit. But I thought that it was really interesting, though, going off some of the conversations that I've had on this show about these different segments within audiology. The reason I wanted to bring you on directly after Mike was because I think that this whole musician side of the audiology world is a little bit, for my own sake, I don't know it all that well. And so I'm curious and I'm trying to learn a lot about it. So walk me through, as a musician, when you were growing up, like how did this whole thing come to be where you go from musician to audiologist?
Yeah, I think it's a interesting path, and I've heard a lot of other people have very similar paths growing up as musicians, just having music in the family. I think that type of upbringing, when you have a musical family and your whole life is playing instruments and being in performance mode, lends itself to appreciating audiology and appreciating our ears in a slightly different way. So maybe that's everybody's commonality. My commonality there was also In addition to just being a sound nut who just like, I like psychoacoustics as a high schooler, that was like my favorite concept to learn about. But also, I injured my ears in not that dramatic of a way. I just developed tinnitus, constant tinnitus, when I was a 13, 14-year-old loud idiot guitar player. And that led me literally into the doors of an audiologist. I got fit with musicians' earplugs at the age of 13 or 14 and wore them ever since. And that brought me through high school. I don't know if I shared much about it with my friends and fellow performers and everything. Maybe I was talking about it a lot with them. I don't really remember that aspect. But what I do remember was when I got to college for production, I was working in venues, working in studios. My ears were giving me some problems. And I think I had pushed my ears a little bit too much, especially in the live settings, a lot of live sound mixing, that I just started looking for answers of how to help my own ears. And without giving away too much about what we're going to talk about throughout the rest of the hour, if the resources that are available now were available then, I wouldn't be an audiologist. I would have just gotten some consults, felt better about my ears, and continue being a musician. I've thought about that a lot. I think I'm very, very honest with that I went into audiology because I couldn't find the resources. They were out there, but they were very far and few between, and I couldn't find them. So I decided to go back to grad school to figure out what was going on with my own ears. And eventually, hopefully, and then it's what came to be, help other musicians, treat this head on.
That's actually a really wild story that you it was really the pursuit
That's
of
how it feels.
audiology was more or less a byproduct of your own desire to get to the bottom of what was going on with yourself. But I actually think that speaks to one of the biggest issues with like hearing healthcare broadly speaking, is that it's so pervasive, yet I think it's so I think it leaves a lot of people unsure of what the first step even is to take.
100%.
I've made this comment before that I think that, and I mean this, like, I'm not trying to be disparaging in any way, but I don't think that the average American at least knows what an audiologist is.
Correct.
And I think that there's a lot of opportunity that provides. But in many ways, I think that it's actually kind of unsurprising that, as extreme as it is to go and pursue a doctoral level degree to figure out what's going on with yourself, it sort of is a microcosm of, I think, the broader issue, which is that, and maybe this is changing, with new media and with like people that are really taking it upon themselves to be a resource for the public, is that I just don't think that there was a great job around communicating to the masses of the full scope of what an audiologist, a hearing healthcare professional, does beyond, because everybody connotates it with hearing aids, unfortunately.
I can't agree more, because my own perspective was I had seen an audiologist as a teenager. I was treated by an audiologist. I was tested. I was given earplugs. I wore those vinyl earplugs, those vinyl musicians' earplugs, until they probably shriveled up.
Yeah.
And yet, when I was tasked with how do I help my own ears, the word audiologist didn't come to mind. I couldn't find. I'm sure if I had searched it further, and now I know, I was in New York City area. There were 3 audiologists who I could have seen in that area, and I talk with some of them now as colleague, and I wish that I just knew those resources and knew how to search for things. Granted, that was a while ago, so we had different ways of searching for stuff, but you're totally right. There's just a lack of public awareness of what we can offer to the healthcare space and offer to people who are having these very niche concerns.
So you go and you get your doctoral. Where did you get your AuD?
Here in Philly. So I'm still stationed in Philly, but
Okay.
Philadelphia has this wonderful grad program at what was then the Pennsylvania College of Optometry. Confusing, I know. They found that out too and changed the name to Salus University.
Oh, okay.
Salus is currently a very large well-known school, great reputation. It is now changing too. I believe this is public knowledge now. It's merging with Drexel University, which is a very large university in the area as well. So it's kind of a complicated answer, but I would say that I went to the Pennsylvania College of Optometry, now Salus, soon Drexel.
I did not know that about the merging. If I understand though, I think Salus is the biggest AUD program from like a headcount
It is.
standpoint, right?
Yeah,
Each
and they
year, I think they
develop.
graduate the largest number of new grads.
That's true, and it's been for a while because early on they developed a remote program, a off-campus program where people could come and get their AUD after already having their masters. And I would I don't know the statistics, but it seemed like for a while every other audiologist who had went back to get their AUD, their doctorate, came out of the Salus, or at that time PCO, Pennsylvania College of Optometry program. That's since closed down. They're not doing the remote program anymore. Nobody is. But their current graduating class is well over 20. I teach there now. I started doing a their hearing conservation and hearing loss prevention program class for the graduate students, and I have 29 students in my class.
Wow, that's
That's a
awesome.
lot. It
That's
is. It's a
great.
lot though. When we're
Okay,
done with this,
so
I have 29 papers that I have to grade.
that sounds enjoyable. Um,
Yes, it's a blast.
so okay, so you go to, we'll call it Salus. You get your AUD. Did you know at this point, obviously you had the background in, you get tinnitus and you've had exposure to an audiologist, so you had some familiarity around this, but
Mhm.
how early into, or even was it before you joined the doctoral program, that you wanted to go into this like hearing conservation side of it and build a business around that?
That's a really good question. It might be a little revisionist history here, but I have this has always been my goal. Signed, when I applied to Salus, I remember in my interview I was talking with, shout out to Trisha Dabrowski, who was sort of the head of the program at that moment, and it did my interview. She made me feel super welcome because as we're talking and I'm blabbing about how I just want to treat musicians and prevent hearing loss, she was pointing at, I believe it was Keb Mo that she had worked with, and she was like, "Yeah, I know what you're talking about. I worked with this blues guy," and I'm like, "Man, I'm home. Like I found it.
That's awesome.
We're good now." So it's really been the whole purpose. Um, the reason why it's revisionist history is because I've been working also in pediatrics. I did about 10 years of my career right after graduating in pediatric hospitals. And I love that work. I really do. I enjoy working with pediatrics. I really enjoyed my colleagues. I have since, for the last almost 2 years now, year and a half, gone full time to just my own work. I've been doing Earmark Hearing Conservation, my own program, for since I graduated, basically doing music audiology. But now that is my full devotion, which means I had to give up pediatrics. And for anybody who's ever worked in pediatric and liked it, unlike Michael Santucci, but if you liked working in pediatrics, you know that it's tough to give that up. That's pretty special work. But
Can I just ask real quick, what were you doing in the pediatric setting? Were you doing like diagnostics or treatment, full battery, everything?
full battery, basically. I wasn't doing cochlear implants, but everything else. The last couple years over at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, amazing place, incredible institution. I was doing a lot of inpatient care, so working with folks who are inpatient and doing a lot of electrophysiology testing while people are in the operating room, that type of work. A lot of hearing testing, I was actually managing a program for the tinnitus patients, anybody who came in with tinnitus. I sort of was the point person for that, as well as the point person for our hearing loss prevention program. So it was kind of a unique program that we have there where we did, and they still do, public outreach and community events. We set up a whole hearing screening program across all these pre-Ks, A lot of work was done in the hearing loss prevention for pediatrics side. Now you're making me miss it, Dave. That wasn't
Yeah.
nice. No, just kidding.
I'm
Um,
walking you down memory lane, reminiscing.
yeah, but hearing loss prevention for pediatrics, it is a kind of unique program. I started it, and it's been handed off since, and going strong, I've heard.
Okay, cool. So you do the pediatric stint for a while, and then 2 years ago, a year and a half ago, you branch off and you start Earmark Conservation. Is that the name of it? Earmark Conservation? Did I get
Yep,
it right?
Earmark Hearing Conservation,
Earmark Hearing Conservation.
which I started basically after graduating, and have been doing it on the side, which a lot
Okay.
of folks know who do niches. It's tough to make a full day job out of something that is quite arguably a niche. But determined about 2 years ago that without devoting full-time attention to it, it was not going to ever grow to where I wanted it to be. So that made the tough decision to step away from the children's work, pediatric
Gotcha.
work.
Okay. All right. So then with what you're doing now, give me a
Mhm.
day in the life, if you will. I bet that it's variable, so it's probably not super consistent. So even if you want to maybe
Yeah.
give me some examples, I'm just curious, like
Mhm.
what goes on within your new or let's call it your side business that's now your full-time hustle.
Yeah, it's a full-time hustle. It's a whole business, which is wild. It's a four-sided business now. Well, it's a really good question. I think you hit it that it's variable, just like your days. Some days you have interviews, some days you're uh, doing all your other duties,
God
and
knows what.
exactly. So you're putting on different hats. I have now, it seems like 4 or 5 different hats, but I can kind of explain the scope of it. One big thing that I'm doing is obviously working with musicians. 1 to 2 days a week, I'm traveling out and seeing folks in their homes, in their studios, in venues, in rehearsal spaces, recording studios, and working with them directly, doing hearing testing, in-ear monitor fittings, earplugs, counseling for tinnitus, all that stuff. I see those folks also in a clinic nearby where I'm lucky enough to get a deal to rent some space for these folks. Um, the other big thing that I'm doing right now is CAOHC course directing, which is, for anybody unfamiliar, it's the Council for Accreditation of Occupational Hearing Conservationists, which means basically nurses, physicians in the occupational health world who do hearing testing. They actually perform more hearing tests than, hate to say this, than even audiologists do in the US every year. And so they need to be trained. And the training programs are these multiple day training sessions, which are very intensive. And we teach people the basics of audiology as well as the ins and outs of the regulations that pertain to industry, mining, all of that. And so I've built a business doing uh, before in-person courses across the Northeast here. And now we've really focused since 2020. Something happened in 2020. I don't remember what, but something happened
Yeah,
that made us go
something
virtual.
happened.
It's on the tip of my
I don't
tongue.
know. It'll come to you.
It'll come to me. It comes to all of us eventually. But I don't mean to be
Literally and
flippant.
figuratively.
I really shouldn't be flippant about the pandemic, but it did change the landscape, and since then we've been really putting a lot of energy into making virtual CAOHC courses a reality, and they've been working really, really well. I am very proud of the program that we've developed, and we do something like 30 courses a year um, through virtually, as well as now we're getting back to doing some in persons. So that's a large percentage of my time nowadays. Probably about 40 to 50% of my business and my time is the CAOHC courses.
Very
And
cool.
then, let's see here. Today's a good example. I spend a lot of time usually interviewing somebody, but today I get the rare
The mic is turned.
sweat-inducing treat of having the mic turned on me
Sitting
and
in the
being
hot seat.
oof oof. Uh, it feels good though. You're a great interviewer, so it kind of
Thanks,
feels
man.
nice. But yeah, getting to produce the show is a labor of love and a joy, and it connects me back with my old life of just producing and recording and editing. Um, and then the other thing that I've been doing a lot of recently is telepractice, teleaudiology, which is something that we could probably spend hours just talking about, because it's this new amazing facet of audiology that probably a couple listeners just did a spit take when we just said we're doing teleaudiology.
Hmm.
But specifically for musicians, there's a program set up through Music Cares, and I had a number of appointments this morning in between managing the business and editing some podcasts. I saw a couple musicians and talked to them about their hearing test results and how to better protect themselves and continue their careers. So, I don't know if that answers your question, but
It does. I want to actually kind of like talk about each of those because I think they're all really
sure,
interesting. So
sure.
the first one, it's with CAOHC. I think this is very interesting because
Hmm.
it's the first thing that comes to mind here is speaking of Salus earlier, Dr. Victor Bray.
Yep.
He and Amin Imlani, who I think is the president-elect of ADA. Those two have done a lot of really good work around the more or less like the state of the labor within hearing healthcare. So, kind of like looking at the full spectrum of hearing instrument specialists, audiologists, ENTs, and
Hmm.
I think that if I'm recalling correctly, there's only like, some ballpark of 15 to 20,000 hearing professionals in the
Hmm.
US.
Yep.
And, I think that we hear some of these sort of phrases thrown around all the time about how many people there are in need of these services. And it's like if you like somehow do the math, it's like you get one audiologist or one hearing healthcare professional for however many people, divide, I
Yes.
guess, the total population by 20,000 if you're being generous. And it still leaves you with all these people. And so I've had some conversations. I had a guy on, John Swin from Johns Hopkins. And,
Hmm.
that was one of the conversation, or one of the aspects of that conversation was we were talking about how I think that one of the best opportunities for audiologists is to find a way to more or less extend themselves. And I think that, again, there's just not enough workers, there's not enough labor. And so I think that I think there's two ways that you can really try to combat that issue. One is making the professional more available. And I think that will
Hmm.
tie into the telehealth stuff. But the other is to allow for them to sort of disseminate their knowledge and expertise to some of these like allied medical professionals. And I think the occupational health people are a perfect example of this. Like to your point,
Really.
they might be performing more screenings than anyone, right? So
Yep.
they're kind of like they're like the early detection apparatus that's really kind of trying to understand like pass fail, but
Hmm.
catching people and understanding like who falls into that. And so I think that again, like I kind of think that there's a bit of a knee-jerk reaction within this community to say that, oh no, like it all needs to be facilitated and administered by audiologists, sort of like the idea that there's a scarcity mentality of like,
Hmm.
that's technically my patient or my colleague's patient. But again, it sort of flies in the face of this whole notion that there are, like tens of thousands of people per every audiologist or every hearing healthcare professional. So I think
100%.
there's a lot of opportunity there. And I think it's really interesting to hear somebody that's like building a business around that because someone's got to train this like extension of a workforce to
Hmm.
do things in the way that would be sort of like vetted and approved by the hearing healthcare professional community.
Completely. I totally respond to that. The numbers that I know are there's about 22 to 23,000 occupational hearing conservationists who are folks who are credentialed and able to do hearing screenings, hearing testings in an occupational setting, um, who aren't audiologists. And all of these hearing tests Not all of them have to be reviewed by audiologists, but some do. So audiologists are involved in the process. But historically, since for about 50 something years, CAOHC has been around training people to do this. And there's only been, at any given moment, 100 to 300 course directors who, typically speaking, are mostly audiologists. There are some who aren't, but mostly it's licensed audiologists doing these trainings, which is to say, it's such a small group of us who are training this vast majority of people doing the vast majority of tests. And it's sort of a shadow part of audiology that,
Mm,
you know, to be honest, I didn't know about when I was in
right.
grad school. And now I teach all my students about it because I want them to know that these are career opportunities. I want them to know that for the exact reason you said, um, through your education, you can educate others and you can create this kind of, it's a pyramid shaped scheme, but we try not
Mm-hmm.
to, you
Not
know
a
what I mean?
it's not a Ponzi scheme.
Not a Ponzi scheme, but it is pyramid shaped because your really great knowledge and skills to educate can then impact. I mean, I've trained over 2,000 OHCs now and occupational hearing conservationists. Each of them is responsible for, if you run the numbers, over 1,000 workers who are
Right.
exposed to hazardous noise. So how many, if you want to be grandiose
Yep.
about it,
Right.
how many workers then have had influence by our, what I think is high quality education? I'm biased, but I think of it as high quality.
I agree.
So I like to think that we are disseminating this information in a much more effective or efficient way
Yep.
than one-on-one with patients. They're both really important, um, but it goes back to something that I think the ADA would respond to as well is, uh, work at the top of your license,
Mm-hmm.
and the top of our license might not be literally in the room with every set of ears, but maybe educating those who are in the room with every set of ears.
Right.
And that's a much higher call. Again, both are important. I love doing one-on-one care, but there is something here to say that this is maybe an evolution, maybe a next step.
Totally. I mean, and I think that there's a lot of nuance to this, but the way I sort of have thought about this is that, you know, the audiologist, in many ways, and again, if you're thinking about it as a spectrum of like, the labor spectrum, so, on one end you have the surgeon, and then on the other you have the instrument specialist, and so in optometry, it's very well defined what the optometrist does, right? Which sits right in the middle. And I think that audiology has sort of, in particular, audiology has sort of struggled with where they sort of fit on that spectrum. And I think that the revenue model of hearing aid sales has sort of pulled them further along over here, when I think that their role actually needs to be closer to the middle in providing. I don't know if it's necessarily like providing the diagnostics as much as it is, I think, being like you just said, that facilitator of, call it, best practices or
Mhm.
standards, or just like the arbiter of like what you're supposed to really be doing. Because I don't think it's feasible to think that, like you as Frank would be doing, you said you've trained 2,000 people. So that would be 200,000 people if we're being, just like taking
Yeah.
these numbers at face value. So I don't know if you would literally have the bandwidth to test 200,000 people. So wouldn't it be a more effective use of your time to kind of cater to the people in the method in which you can do the masses? And then I see the professional and the audiologist is like, the one-on-one visits will remain and will continue to remain because those are the people that really need your help. And
Yep.
so it's kind of a matter of like, how do you triage that in such a way so that you're getting people coming to you, that truly warrant that level of care,
Mhm.
and that's kind of how I've thought about it, is that this whole thing with like the chaos stuff is actually, I think, incredibly exciting. And I think it's something where it just allows for the value of audiology and the provision of that knowledge to just be
Mhm.
so much more mass disseminated in a way that I think you're going to just ultimately get way more people through the doors that should be coming through the doors, if you will.
Completely. I mean, that speaks to what you were saying before about accessibility, reducing barriers to good care, goes down to really good education and really good access to training. And then one other layer that we haven't even talked about, so who knows which one of these we're going to get time to chat about, but another layer of kind of how to work at the top of your license is doing consulting. Because as an audiologist, I mean, everybody who's listening to this is an audiologist, you have unique depth of knowledge into how not just the hearing system works and not just how the patient's hearing system works, but how hearing technology can affect larger groups of people. So I've dipped my toes into this now, and I'm doing some consulting with some really interesting companies who are able to do advance how we do hearing loss prevention, advance how we do hearing testing in these non-clinical settings or non-audiology clinical settings. One group that I'm working with, if it's okay to name them, SoundTrace, which is able to do this higher level sort of a machine learning almost algorithm, which I don't fully understand what that means, but bringing the understanding of how the audio test and the noise monitoring for an individual worker can combine together to create an understanding of risk far beyond simple calculations. We can actually make it personalized and accurate for the individual, which means more impactful, which means we're actually protecting people and saving people's hearing. The other group that I'm working with very closely, Tuned, the one that does the televisits, is working on some, advanced practices for how to do occupational hearing conservation program management and make it available that the program managers can actually see high level details and make decisions based on metrics that they never had access to before based on old technology. And suddenly, with all this data in front of them, they can say, oh, we actually need to address this, we need to address that. It takes so much burden out of those who want to do really, really good, but don't have the resources or the knowledge base. Present it with them. Take the resource side out of it, present the solutions, and then all they have to do is put boots on the ground and deal with it in the moment. It reduces barriers, increases accessibility, and suddenly we can actually start improving the hearing loss prevention programs in the US and in the world.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And one of the things that really stood out when I had the conversation with Mike Santucci was when we started talking about sort of like the collective effort here and the roles and the responsibilities. And I remember he was saying about how, it's not enough, like within the, take like your standard run of the mill concert. I think that there's just so much public education that still needs to be done about, I mean, we, in every other aspect of public health, there's like so much like education and messaging, and our hearing healthcare seems to just be, maybe it's coming down the line, like it's a laggard or something like that, but it's bizarre how there's so little attention to that. And it's an interesting kind of thought experiment to think about how that could change, would we, from the actual venue itself having signage that displays, like the need to, this is a loud environment, you'll want to wear earplugs in this setting, and then have those for sale or something like that. And I think like Apple's actually really interesting. Like I wear an Apple Watch. And so, having a sound level meter in there is, I think, doing a tremendous service for people to realize like, whoa, this is a really loud environment. Like I tell this story sometimes, but I was at the dentist and my watch was going off because of the drill. And I showed the lady and she's not wearing any hearing protection. I'm like, you work in a hazardous level of noise every single day. You should wear some ear protection and give your patients some ear protection too. But again, it's just one of those things that and even in like an ancillary medical professional like that, they don't fully grasp the thing here. So there is like so much work to be done, I think. And it, which I think you can look at if you're a professional or whatever, is like that equates to a lot of opportunity. But I mean, I just see this as being something where, and I'll be curious to hear from you, like even within the musicians that you're seeing and stuff like that, like when they're coming to you, um, what's their experience been like with hearing conservation? Are they wearing hearing protection? Have they been given an education on like what's actually going on besides it's loud? Because that was a point that Mike made too, was again, all of this is just to say that like I think that um there's just a lot of opportunity here because of how much progress still needs to be made.
I agree completely. And I'm so glad that you brought up Mike again so we can circle back to him. He is such a he would hate me for saying this, but like really an inspiration for how we can practice ethically, how we can focus on the big picture, focus on the meaning behind our care, even in the face of a sometimes chaotic work environment. I mean, we're seeing people in very strange environments, venues being not the least of them. But seeing folks in this unregulated, unstandardized setting, it takes a moral compass to keep the focus right on what we're supposed to be doing and having a sort of ethical code that has not been really written down. And he is a wonderful, guidepost for all of us because he's very very clear about that ethical code and that moral compass. And again, he would hate me for saying all this, but I really do blame him for music audiology being on everybody's minds right now, being
Yeah.
in our conferences, being something that is even showing up on your podcasts, because it's his it's his genuineness that people
Mhm.
respond to,
Yeah. I
because
mean,
he's yeah, go ahead.
just he was I just think about like just some of the stories he told, both on air and off. I mean, I think it's I I just think about, in my eyes, who could be a better advocate for hearing conservation than the
Mhm.
musicians. And so I
Yep.
think that they're such an important segment of customers. I don't think it's about the glitz and the glamour of doing business with music professionals, which, let's be clear, I think is actually really cool. Like going to a
Mhm.
show and getting to know the musicians, like that's really cool. But I think that the way more exciting aspect of that is the more musicians that you can get on board with this idea of understanding the importance of protecting their hearing, and then just having that be part of the culture in the music
Mhm.
scene of, it's not like frowned upon to wear earplugs in your ears at the show.
Yep.
It's little cultural things like that that I think I think it needs to almost be ushered in by the musicians that can sort of
Mhm.
lend their coolness, if you will, to it.
Yeah.
And so I think that like Mike's a very, very humble guy, but I get the sense that one of the biggest contributions he's made is he has more or less gotten the implicit endorsement of a lot of these big time musicians. And over the last few decades, that's sort of cascaded into more musicians, more audiologists that are facilitating this kind of thing. It's just growing. And I,
Mhm.
again, think it's such an important segment because I think it's the kind of segment that can usher in cultural change in the sense that where, again, people start to look at protecting your ears at a show as being something that you do, and it's not really even an afterthought. And then that
Yeah.
then carries into other parts of life.
I 100%. And so, I mean, your direct question before was musicians and if they are, what is their like level of knowledge, understanding, expertise in this area? And it has grown dramatically. Dramatically has grown. In my 15 something years now of seeing musicians as an from the audiology perspective, there is a difference where before they were very much like me saying like, Well, I don't know. Like I put some foam earplugs. I mean, I think back to this a lot, this particular one, but I put foam earplugs out at the front of a venue that I used to work at, um, because I thought, well, this is loud, right? So let's protect people. So let's put some foam earplugs out. That was it. That was what I thought. I thought I did a good job. I gave myself a gold sticker for that effort. But that's not a hearing conservation program. That's not hearing loss prevention. That's throwing band-aids at
Yeah.
at a terrible situation. There's a house fire, throw band-aids at it. That's
Mm.
basically the solution that I was doing, which is
Cups
silly.
of water.
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't effective and it wasn't helpful. And now I see people uh, so much further down the path towards some people just literally during these visits lecturing to me about what they've been doing and how they've been protecting themselves. And frankly, I'm getting ideas of how to handle certain odd situations. I just had a guy, I hope this doesn't dox him, who does is it gamelan or gamelan orchestra, the it's like big, basically brass, like xylophone uh instruments that just are loud and clanking. It sounds amazing in person, but he was
Okay.
saying like, this is too loud for me. And he taught me a little bit of how to protect people. The next person who comes along who does that, I'm going to know a little bit more about how to protect them because this person's thought about it for years. Who turned him onto it? I don't know, but I'm also going to blame Michael Santucci for that, for probably whoever turned him onto hearing protection also turned was influenced maybe by somebody that Michael talked to. So I completely agree. Um, I'm seeing a huge change, a huge culture shift, and it's coming about because more people are willing to talk about it, both pro musicians,
Hmm.
the list of pro musicians who are outspoken and willing to share their hearing damage has grown hugely,
Yeah.
exponentially. And that's a wonderful thing. Now, obviously, nobody needs to dox themselves and come out with their own public health information and share that. But that's partially what spurred on me doing my podcast. Is I had enough people who said, like, essentially, how can I help spread this information, because they became such avid apostles. No, that's
Hmm.
not the right word. Believers.
Yeah.
They really wanted to say, hey, if I could talk to 15-year-old me and stop 15-year-old me from getting the ear damage that got me to this point, what would I want to say? And is there a platform for that? So I've been trying to make that platform, but really it does come back down to people like Michael even starting this conversation.
Yeah, for sure. So with the podcast,
Mhm.
you know, as a fellow podcaster, I feel like
Yeah,
you can relate that one of my favorite parts of it are is just meeting the guests and building
yeah.
relationships that way. Um, you've been doing this now for what, a year and a half. What
Hmm.
really stands out to you of the episodes that you've done? Whether you want to talk about individual episodes, individual
Hmm.
people, or just the broad themes of what your takeaways are of doing your podcast, which I think is also a very niche focused thing, which is there are pros and cons of that, but I think one of the biggest pros is that if you're a if you're a curious person about what you're podcasting about, it's just like one giant Alice in Wonderland rabbit
Yeah.
hole, and you just keep going further and further down into it. I always joke that I think I'm quickly becoming the most knowledgeable layperson about audiology that's not an audiologist, and it's largely
Hmm.
because of the conversations I have on this podcast. So, what's kind of been your experience?
Again, you made me fall out of my chair. I'm at a standing desk, so that's an idiom. But you basically made me fall out of my chair when you told me that the last time I had listened to your shows. We've had conversations, and then I said, "Well, as an audiologist," and he said, "I'm not." I'm like, "What?" Like that'd be like two birds flying up in the air, and one being like, "Well, as a fellow bird," and the other one's like, "Me, I'm a dog." Like,
Yeah.
I think you're
Well,
flying.
pretty much.
Uh, no, it humbles the rest of us that we should really uh, I should read more papers. To answer your question more directly, I think I've been surprised by a lot of things. The biggest thing that I've been surprised by is who's the audience. We thought we were making a show for musicians, and we thought we were making a show for audience members and music enthusiasts. I hate using that word, but people who care about the artist's perspective, either from the stage because they've been there or because it's interesting to hear. It's always interesting to hear musicians talk, right? They're very interesting people. Let's put a microphone in front of them and stand back, and it's always going to be interesting. What's odd is I feel like most of our response, positive and constructive, has been from the audiology community. And I honestly didn't expect that. So we've taken a slight turn in how we produce shows. Very early on, I had a very simple formula of get a person on who's had something happen to their ears and who has something interesting to talk about it, and let them talk. And in my show, I like to share their music as well, because I feel like not hearing the music of a musician is like seeing half of a person's face. It's very incomplete. You don't get the nuance of what they're talking about. Like once, I had a good example at one of our first episodes, was a drummer who plays in a really loud band, and he's a really loud drummer. And I can say he's a loud drummer, or I can play you a recording of the loudest drums you've ever heard. Which one gets the point across better? So I use, and you mentioned this earlier, maybe it was before we hit record, but why we use so much music in the, or how we use music in Talking Ears. And it's because of that, because I want nuance and clarity as far as who this person is. And that's the best way to understand a musician, is just to listen to what they put out. And the second thing is, I find that I want to hear my voice less in these episodes. I want to pull out my commentary and my personality from the show as much as possible, just leave enough there so that, people don't forget that I disappeared or don't think that I disappeared. But I can replace most of what I said with their music. And it basically gets the point across much better than anything I could have said. So if I had my own devices, I wouldn't be the host. I'm not a natural host. I'm not a natural get in front of the mic and be the person who's in the spotlight, which is why I play keyboards and guitar and I stand in the background, and I prefer that. But I felt like this just had to happen, and there was nobody else wanted to do it, so I'm doing it. And now I've got a co-host, which is fantastic, Dr. Juan Vasquez. He's an audiologist in Chicago, and he is really, I got to blame him for this show actually continuing, because as a fellow podcaster, there is a grind to it. The grind, it can get tedious.
You hit peaks and valleys too, for sure. You go through periods where you don't really want to do it anymore. So it's really important to have a co-host, or even just somebody that's like, I don't have a co-host, but I've got a couple people that have been like long time repeat guests that every now and then I'll have to bring one of them on just to kind of like, just change it back up a little bit and give me almost a like a break, a breath of fresh air before getting back into it. But the interesting thing for me, and not to like just make this about me, but I bet you can relate to this, is that sometimes when I'm feeling maybe like least motivated by my show and everything, something will change and come along, and then I'll get really interested in that. And again, it's the Alice in Wonderland rabbit hole, where you go down something and that leads to like a totally new facet and tangent. And then like from there, it's just, I don't know, I've been doing this long enough now to know that like, so long as you want to continue, the name of the game is just kind of keep going. And I think that because like there's so much serendipity when it comes to a podcast, whether it's like determining who your next guest is going to be, the next topic that you really want to discuss. So much of it for me has been a really small aside in the last episode where I'm like, wait, that was a really interesting point. Who's the person that I should have on to like really flesh that out? So I feel like that's a challenge for people that are producing content in general is like you hit these lulls, but I think that it's just part of the process. Trust the process. You know that in Philly.
Yep. Trust the process. I say that more often than I actually understand what that reference means. I'm not a sporty person, but you gotta trust the process. I couldn't agree more. And as long as you have something, it's not about having something interesting to say, it's having an interesting topic to explore. And there's nothing more interesting to audiologists than hearing and ears and sound. And there's nothing more interesting to musicians than hearing and ears and sound. And so we're just trying to push those two things together and see what, see what fires we can make with that. And I I mean, Juan and I were just having a production meeting earlier this week where we looked back at our list of potential guests and potential topics, and it is just never ending. And that excites me and exhausts me to equal measure. So that's why having a partner in crime in this is so important, because you have to have a sounding board to be able to say, hey, are we going far enough? Do we need to take a pause? And keeping that motivation going. There's always something more interesting around the corner with these shows. I mean, I think you hit it that like there's just another kind of facet to pull out. In my position, a lot of our guests come from patients that I've seen. And when a person is talking to me, and I'm going to say this and regret it, because then if there's any future patients who hear this, they're going to be like, now I know how to get on the show. But if they're talking to me and I hear, if I can, like, I'm not a journalist, but you're a journalist, right? If you can hear that story in your head of like, man, I just want to let this person run for an hour in front of a microphone.
You immediately know, you're like, oh, this person would be a fantastic guest.
Exactly.
And I bet you get that with the patients that you're seeing are like,
I do.
You have
and then there's other time
story and a view on this and perspective.
There's definitely times where the story is too personal. The story is nothing that they want to share, and that's fine. I've had guests actually pull out from being guests on the show because they just said, hey, look, you know what?
It's really personal.
I don't want to share it. Totally fine. Nobody has to share it. But I've had other people who said, I don't want to, but I need to, because it's really important to me and my community that this gets shared. And then now we've had a lot of guests who are audiologists, engineers. Michael Santucci was on an episode. People who are kind of adjacent to that core, what I think of as kind of my core guest of a person with a story and music, who we can expand this conversation. And now we're even talking about having music audiology panels of just music audiologists come on and talk about the topics, because apparently this is something that people want to hear, and I'm overjoyed to be able to share it with them.
That's awesome. I want to close here and just kind of wrap up with looking to the future, you know, you said you're currently, you're teaching classes of 30 plus students in some of these classes. With your own personal experience, when you first kind of came into this, and again, it's like, it's nice to have this conversation directly after the one with Mike Santucci, because, he was sort of like the first generation of these music audiologists. And then, so now you've got Heather and Shannon and, some of these different people that were sort of right that next crop. And then I feel like you and some of these, like this next generation 3, where you're like 2.5, it just seems like it keeps growing. And I'd be really curious to hear about what's the mindset of the young professional today with regard to this space. How are they looking at it based on your interactions with them? Like, is there some aspect to this that they're gravitating toward, that they're looking at and saying, whether it's their sustainability there, or this jives with what I want to do, where it marries musicians and music and then audiology? I'm just curious of what you feel is maybe at the heart of why there seems to be more of a push in this direction within the next crop of grads.
Man, that is such a good question. And I like that you're bringing it back to that, because I think early on, when I started working in towards doing a music audiology business, I was mentored a little bit with, or a lot. Let me rephrase that. Mentored a lot by Brian Fliger over in Boston. Great guy, great friend. He was running a musician's hearing program, and I did my 4th year up with him at the Children's Hospital. He mentored me and showed me the ropes on kind of the business and the patient care of music audiology. And what I kind of took away and emphasized to anybody who would ask about or ask that question was that music audiology will always be a niche and always be a side hustle because of just kind of the number of folks that you have as far as a pool. And what my answer is now, it's changing dramatically because now I'm talking with folks, either students, my own students in a grad program, or I meet with a lot of students or early professionals at conferences. And now that we have telepractice, now that we have more awareness in the audiology community, there's more demand for our time and needs, and more respect in that sense too. I don't think that that's the case anymore. I really think that this can be, for those people who are really devoted to this, a full-time work, just like it is for the Heathers and me and a couple other folks, Lisa Tenenbaum out on the West Coast. There's a handful of us who this is what we do now. And that is an option. And I don't know if that was so much an option before, a viable, reachable goal option, but I do believe it's a career path now. As far as why, I don't, I think that it's coming from the music community. I think it's a spiral, right? The Michaels of the world are educating the musicians. The musicians are now asking for our care, and the local audiologists, that sounds derogatory, your general practitioner audiologist is now receiving a whole lot of more influx of requests,
Right.
and looking towards things like AAA, asking, hey, is there a practice guideline on this? And Michael led our task force to write a clinical consensus document in 2020 to put it out there so that there is some guidance and it's not just shooting in the dark anymore. And, we have people like Marshall Chasin, who's written numerous textbooks and guidance and has a blog about how to do this stuff well and efficiently and effectively and care about the musician. And I think we're at a bit of a crossroads. We're at like an inflection point where we can start seeing this be a more viable,
Yeah.
for a new audiologist coming into the field. This becomes a more viable option, and I'm so excited about that.
Mm-hmm.
I really am.
Right. I mean, I think you're right there that, it is a spiral. And I think like one thing sort of precipitates the next, where
Mm-hmm.
you get somebody like, this really influential character like a Michael that I think everything just sort of dovetails into the next. You then have more musicians are interested in this, and that means that more audiologists are getting inquiries about this, and so then they're looking for specialty training. And I'm sure, like, one of the things we talked about with him is his Sensophonics Gold Circle program.
Yep.
Which I think is incredibly important. Again, I just look at this and say, it's not just young people, it's just this notion of being the forever student and having the humility to like keep learning and just say like I can do more, because I think at the end of the day it's going to behoove you to have something that caters to this increasing demand. And again, I kind of think that is full circle to the reason there's more demand is because there's more awareness in the music community now of how severe this is. When you see these stories coming out from guys like Huey Lewis, and it's like, I think that there is a level of fear almost of like, I need to take this thing serious. And I don't know if that's like kind of always been the case, or if maybe that is generationally changing,
Mm-hmm.
where younger musicians are understanding the severity of this and wanting to be very proactive early on. But again, I think that then leads to these conversations that are being had, and that's probably where you're seeing all of this kind of trickle down into this new increasing demand of the at the like emerging graduate level of wanting to specialize in this.
Oh, there's a third layer to the spiral too that has changed, which is the technology is
Mm,
now there to support the care. So back in the 70s,
totally.
for instance, you had people like Pete Townsend is a good example of a loud rocker who was at the forefront of technology and was able to make louder sounds than other people could with their guitar. Great, awesome, go for it. We didn't know the risks, so what's the harm to it? And hearing protection devices weren't available that sounded anywhere decent to musicians.
That's a
So
great point.
I don't even see that
It's a
as like
non-starter.
it's a non-starter. So at
Mhm.
that point, it's like the fact that Pete Townsend now is an advocate for hearing loss prevention and discussing his own tinnitus and hearing loss, it's not a failed system. It's the system evolving and improving. And the fact that now, Michael's company and a bunch of other advances at Emodic creating earplugs that actually work on stage for the vast majority of musicians, in-ear monitors have improved, our ability to test in strange environments. My audiometer fits in my backpack. So I can go
Right.
anywhere and do diagnostic hearing tests. That was not the case before. And so our abilities to telepractice, our abilities to
Mhm.
do this has finally caught up with the need to do this. Maybe that's the best way of saying it.
Yeah. No, that's a great point. I think you're spot on there because the in my mind, I think one of the biggest challenges that like a guy like Michael probably had to face was how do you say you just seem like such a like the fun police where you're saying,
Mm-hmm.
hey, musician, the thing that you love, that's your livelihood, I'm going to come in and tell you that you need to like turn it down because it's not safe. um and I think that in the past, people probably just perceived that as that was going to like distort and tarnish the way that it actually sounded and the whole experience and everything. And I think that like through his work and I think through this progression of time where you have had all this innovation, where you really do have the ability now to sort of preserve the integrity of the music, but just do it in a way
Yep.
that's safe. That is dramatically different than what existed when he started.
Mm-hmm.
So again, kudos to all the giants that came before us that like everybody is kind of standing on these shoulders. Because like I think that it's whatever we think is difficult now, like imagine how challenging selling
Yeah.
somebody on that concept was back when you were using vinyl and that was the only option. And like just imagine
Mm-hmm.
the kind of the effect that that does. I can imagine he was met with some pretty fierce opposition initially. He said he
Yeah.
was laughed out of the first room that he was like exhibiting at,
Yep. And I
so
think that we really have to thank those pioneers, let's call it that, who had the audacity to just kind of push through it forward with that. Because
mhm.
I look at myself in the mirror and I say, I have a passion for this, but do I have entrepreneurial audacity to push forward in headwinds like that? Probably not. Which isn't to say, if you want to topple me, all you have to do is just, blow a hard wind at me and I'm going to fall over. But in truth, like we all have a limit to how much we can push and how much we can change literally the culture. And I think it takes a certain amount of healthy, the word arrogance gets a bad rap, but like a certain healthy arrogance to say, no, this is right. No, this
Yeah,
is important. And
owning your expertise, owning your domain. You
yeah,
know more about this than anyone, and I
eh,
don't think that's arrogance. I think
yeah,
that's just uh subject matter expertise.
yep. You had Kathleen Wallace on,
I did. Yep.
and she talked a lot about this word expert. And I got really into that part of the conversation because it touches on how we present ourselves, and this circles back to almost everything we've talked about. Of you can present yourself uh, at the top of your license, and realize that the skills that we have as hearing healthcare knowledgeable professionals goes beyond um, it includes the patient care. I don't want to let go of that. It includes the one-on-one patient care, but it can go beyond that, and we can spread our information as wide as possible. And I think that that's where audiology needs to keep pushing itself. It's not a crowded space. That's the other thing I want to say. There needs to be more people in all of these things that we've talked about. This isn't a club that has a entrance fee or any high barriers. It's not a crowded space. Free admission, please. Come on over. I'll bring the pizza.
Yeah, no, it's, this is a perfect place to wrap, because sure. I think like you're very similar, and Kathleen is like the poster child of the kinds of people that I feel like I'm so fortunate to have met through this podcast. Because for me, having like a strong conviction that this industry is going to continue to do well in the future, it all stems from the kinds of interactions that I've had with people like you, people like her, where I can see now it's becoming more and more like in focus of how you could successfully have a business that's not the traditional private practice, but it's like the 2023 version of it, the millennial version of it, where, it's like, okay, so, and I think it's so cool that she's doing something very different, but it's a different take on everything that she's doing. Is like the methodology of it is so modernized. And again, I'm not saying that it's superior or anything like that. It just lends itself to like totally different ways in which you can bring value to the market, and therefore you can like build a business around it. And the same thing with what you're doing around hearing conservation is, for me, like that's just so encouraging to hear that there are multiple ways. These are just two examples. There are lots and lots. And I'm going to keep trying to flesh them out on this podcast of like, if I were a young professional getting started, or if I were looking for a career change in this, I think there are many options available to people. But I think it boils down to identifying what you are naturally suited for, and, kind of like it plays to your strengths. But I think that the most encouraging thing is that there's so much more nuance in hearing healthcare than just like selling and administering hearing aids. That's obviously a huge part of it, but like there's so many other revenue generation possibilities, and also just ways that the audiologist can remain relevant, I think, like far into the future, that has nothing to do with hearing aids per se. That's just one facet of what they're doing, but there's so much more to that. And I think that's kind of the goal right now, is like to kind of almost rebrand in the eyes of the public, to say that this is the medical professional for all things ears, which we now know like there's a so much relationship between the ears and the brain. And so it's like an evolving thing that I think just continues to shed more and more light and illustrate the importance of this professional. I think there's tremendous opportunity here, but a lot of it has to come down to like people sort of Lewis and Clarking it, and like figuring out like, all right, let's go down this route and flesh it out and make sure that this thing there's no wildebeest down that way.
Or how to use them to your advantage. And there's been pioneers, especially in music audiology, who didn't have a chance to share their pioneering. I could name them if I wanted to, but they don't get enough credit for that, and partially because there wasn't platforms like your platform. So it brings it full circle back to our conversation. It's a spiral that the dissemination of knowledge, the dissemination of information, the public awareness that you're creating helps prompt this kind of movement forward, because hopefully there's a grad student who's listening who goes, I'm going to change my path slightly because I just heard that.
I'm going to reach out to Frank. So perfect segue.
Not me.
As we close here, where can people connect with you? What's the best way to link up for those that might be interested?
Yep. I am very accessible by email. You can go to my website, earmarkhc, as in hearingconservation.com. My email address is frank, that's me, at earmarkhc.com. You can also find information about our show called Talking Ears. You can just search it in any of your podcast players. We are trying to be more active on the social medias, but unlike Kathleen Wallace, I am not a natural at that. And so I think if you want to reach out, the best ways are probably through the website.
Cool, man. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Frank. I've really enjoyed the conversation, getting to know you a little bit better, and learning more about what you're doing. So thanks for everybody who tuned in here to the end. We will chat with you next time. Cheers.